My name is Frank. I'm 70 years old. And apparently, at 70, you're no longer allowed to own anything you haven't used in the last 6 months. My wife came into the kitchen one Saturday morning and said, "Frank, we're downsizing." I was drinking coffee. I almost choked. I said, "What do you mean, downsizing?" She said, "The house." I said, "What about the house?" "We have too much stuff." I looked around. I didn't see too much stuff. I saw our life. There is a difference. My wife looked at the living room. "Look at all this." I said, "That's furniture." She said, "We don't need all of it." I said, "We have a house. Furniture is part of the agreement." She sighed. Then she said the sentence every married man learns to fear. "We need to simplify." Simplify. That's a beautiful word. It sounds peaceful. It sounds like fresh air, open windows, less clutter. But when your wife says it, what she means is, "I'm about to throw away your history." I said, "What exactly are you planning to get rid of?" She said, "Things we don't use." I said, "Define use." She said, "Frank." I said, "That's a broad category." She walked over to an old wooden cabinet. "What is this?" I said, "That's important." "What does it do?" "It stores things." "What things?" I opened it. Inside were batteries, old keys, 3 flashlights, a stapler, some screws, a tape measure, 2 instruction manuals for appliances we haven't owned since the Clinton administration, and a small box labeled "Important." She opened the box. It contained a key. She looked at me. "What does this key open?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "Then why do you have it?" I said, "Because someday we're going to need it." She stared at me. "When?" "I don't know." "Frank." "What?" "We're 70. "I know." "That key is older than our marriage." "That's why it's trustworthy." She laughed. I didn't. I've reached the age where keeping something for 25 years is considered evidence. I told her, "We should not throw things away just because we don't currently know what they're for." She said, "That is exactly why we should throw them away." I knew we were going to have a problem. Then she brought out a cardboard box. I recognized it immediately. "No." She said, "What?" "No." "You haven't even opened it." "I know what's in it." "What?" "My things." She opened it anyway. Inside was an old cassette player, 3 cassette tapes, a broken radio, a portable fan, a stack of old photographs, and something wrapped in newspaper. She said, "What is that?" I said, "Don't touch that." She opened it. It was a coffee maker, an old one, the kind with a glass pot, 2 switches, and absolutely no Wi-Fi. I smiled. She said, "This doesn't work." I said, "It might." She said, "Frank, the cord is cut." I looked at it. I said, "That's a minor issue." She laughed. I said, "You never know." She said, "You haven't used this since 1996. I said, "That's because we've had newer ones." "Then why keep it?" "Because the newer ones always break." She pointed at the dead coffee maker. "This one is broken." "That's different." "How?" "It has history." She shook her head. Then she said, "Everything in this house has history." I said, "Exactly." She looked at me. "That is not an argument." I said, "It is to me." Then she went for the garage. I stood up. "Wait." She said, "What?" "Why are you going into the garage?" "Because that's where the real problem is." I said, "There is no problem in the garage." She opened the door. The garage was full. Boxes, tools, old chairs, Christmas decorations, wood, paint cans, a bicycle, 2 lawn chairs, an old television, 3 toolboxes, a vacuum, a fan, a box labeled cables, a box labeled more cables,
and a third box labeled, "Cables I Don't Trust." My wife looked at it. She said, "Frank." I said, "Those are different." "How?"
I don't know yet. She put her hands on her hips. Where do we even start? I said, we don't. She said, we're starting now. I said, why? Because we're downsizing. I said, who decided that? You and me? I don't remember voting. She looked at me. I said, fine. That word has kept many marriages alive. We started with the garage. She pointed at an old lawnmower. You haven't used that in years. I said, it works. Does it? I think so. Have you started it? No. How long? About 8 years. She stared at me. I said, it's a reliable machine. She said, it's a lawnmower you haven't started in 8 years. I said, that's how reliable I think it is. She laughed. Then she pointed at an old television. This has to go. No. Why? It works. It's a tube television. So? We don't even have cable. Then we won't have to worry about buffering. She smiled. You're keeping a television because it doesn't have internet? Exactly. She said, where are you going to put it? I looked around. I said, somewhere. She said, Frank. I said, I'm working on the details. Then she picked up an old answering machine. What is this? I said, an answering machine. She laughed. You know phones have voicemail now? I don't trust voicemail. Why? Because I don't know where it lives. She looked at me. I said, this one has a tape. You know where the message is. She put it down. It's going. I said, no. She said, why? I said, it belonged to your mother. She stopped. We both looked at it. She picked it up again. She said quietly, I forgot. I said, I didn't. She smiled. Okay. She put it back. And that's when I realized something. This wasn't really about the garage. It wasn't even about the stuff. We weren't just cleaning a house. We were deciding which parts of our lives were still allowed to exist. And suddenly, I didn't want to make this easy for her. Not because I wanted a cluttered house,
But because I wasn't ready to watch 40 years disappear into cardboard boxes. So I did what any reasonable 70-year-old husband would do. I made a plan. I was going to save everything. My wife created rules. Of course she did. She got a marker. She made 3 signs. Keep, donate, trash. I said, you're enjoying this. She said, I'm being organized. I said, that's what people say right before they throw away something important. She handed me the first item, a broken lamp. Keep, donate, or trash. I said, keep. She said, it doesn't work. It might. She said, Frank. I said, keep. She put it in the keep pile. Then a second lamp. Keep, donate, or trash. Keep. A third. Keep. A fourth. She said, how many lamps do we need? I said, as many as we have. She stared at me. I said, that's a strong number. Then she found an old toaster. Keep, donate, or trash. Keep. Does it work? Probably. Probably? I haven't used it lately. How lately? Maybe 10 years.
Trash. I grabbed it.
No, she said, Frank. I said, you don't understand. What don't I understand? This toaster survived 3 moves. She looked at it. It doesn't toast. I know. Then what does it do? I said, it survives. She laughed.
I said, "That's more than I can say for some modern appliances." She put it down. Then she found something I hadn't seen in years, an old toolbox. I took it from her. She said, "What is that?" "My father's." She stopped. I opened it. Inside were screwdrivers, pliers, a small hammer, a wrench, a measuring tape, some nails. Everything was old. Everything was scratched. Everything looked like it had been used 1,000 times. I remember my father using that toolbox. When I was a kid, I'd follow him around the house. He could fix anything: a chair, a radio, a broken door, a leaking faucet, the toaster. He'd open something up, look at it, and say, "Let's see." That was his entire repair strategy. Let's see. No tutorial, no YouTube, no AI.
Just a screwdriver and confidence. I said, "I'm keeping this." My wife didn't argue. She just said, "Okay." That was the first time I realized this process wasn't going to be simple. Every object had a story. A chair wasn't just a chair. It was the chair from our first apartment. A bowl wasn't just a bowl. It was the bowl my wife used when the kids were little. A box wasn't just a box. It contained photographs, old receipts, Christmas cards, a letter from my brother. You can't measure memories by how often you use them. That's the problem with downsizing. A stranger looks at something and says, "You never use this." You say, "No." They say, "Then you don't need it." But they don't understand. Sometimes you don't keep something because you need it. You keep it because it reminds you who you were. My wife understood that. She just didn't want to keep everything. That was the problem. I had a very broad definition of everything. She had a much smaller one.
By lunchtime, the garage was worse than before. Boxes everywhere, things stacked on tables. 3 piles. The keep pile was growing. The trash pile looked depressed. The donate pile had almost nothing in it. My wife looked at me. "You're not getting rid of anything." I said, "That's not true." "What did you donate?" I pointed. "A box." She opened it. "Frank." "What?" "These are empty picture frames." "Exactly." "Why would anyone want them?" "Someone does." She laughed. "I give up." I said, "Good." Then she walked inside. I sat down. I looked around. I felt pretty good. I'd protected the garage. Then my wife came back with a roll of black contractor bags. She dropped them beside me. "What are those?" "Plan B." I said, "What's Plan B?" She smiled. "You'll find out." I didn't like that smile. That evening we ate dinner. Quietly. Too quietly. My wife said, "I've been thinking." I said, "That always worries me." She smiled. "We need to be realistic." About our age. I stopped eating.
She said, "I'm not saying something bad is going to happen, okay? But at our age, we should make things easier for ourselves." She was right. I knew she was right, but I didn't want to say it. She continued, "What happens when we can't manage this house?" I looked around. The kitchen, the dining room, the old photographs, the furniture, the walls, our life. I said, "Then we'll figure it out." She smiled. "That's what you've always said." "What?" "Let's see." I laughed. That was my father's phrase. "I know." "You remember?" "Of course." She reached across the table. She took my hand. "We don't need to throw away our life, Frank." I looked at her. "We just don't need to store all of it in the garage." I smiled. Then I said, "Fair." She smiled. "Good." I said, "But I'm keeping the toaster." She laughed. "Of course you are." The next week I made a discovery. There was a storage facility 3 miles from our house. My neighbor Carl told me about it. He said, "You should get a small unit." I said, "Why?" "To move some stuff out of the house." I said, "That's exactly what my wife wants." "Then there you go." I thought about it. Maybe this was the solution. We wouldn't throw things away, we'd simply move them somewhere else. That was brilliant. I rented a small storage unit, 8 by 10. Perfect. My wife looked at it. She said, "What are you putting in there?" I said, "Things." She said, "What things?" "Important things." She sighed. I didn't tell her everything. We started moving boxes. 1 box, 2 boxes, 3. Then the old television, then the lamps, then the chairs, then the toaster, then the answering machine, then the cables I didn't trust. The unit filled quickly, too quickly. I stood outside one afternoon sweating, trying to fit a bicycle through the door. Carl walked by. He said, "You said this was for downsizing." I said, "It is." "Looks like you're moving." "No." "Then why do you have more stuff?"
I said, "It's organized." He looked inside. Boxes were stacked to the ceiling. He said, "That's not organized. It's vertical." He laughed. I closed the door. I went home. My wife asked, "How's the storage?" "Perfect." "How much room do we have left?" "A little." "How little?" I said, "We can still open the door." She stared at me. "Frank." "What?" "You rented a storage unit so you could keep everything." "No." "What did you do?" "I relocated it." She laughed. "That's not downsizing." "It is if it's not in the house." She shook her head. I thought I'd won. Then one afternoon she said, "Let's go see it." I froze. "Why?" "I'm curious." "No." "Why not?" "It's not ready." "Ready for what?" "Inspection." She laughed. "I want to see it." I said, "It's boring." "Frank." "Yes." "I am your wife." "I know." "I know when you're lying." I said, "That's unfair." She grabbed her keys. "Let's go." We drove there. We opened the unit. She stood there. Silence. Boxes. Boxes. More boxes. A television.
4 lamps. A bike. 3 chairs. A coffee maker. The toaster. A stack of old magazines. She looked at me. I said, "It's less at home." She covered her face. I said, "Look at it this way." "No." "We've created another room." "No." "A storage room." "That's what storage units are." "Exactly." She walked in. She picked up a box. "What is this?" "Christmas." She opened it. Inside were Christmas decorations. "Why do we need 6 boxes of Christmas decorations?" "Because it's Christmas." "Once a year." "Exactly." She looked at another box. "What's this?" "Children's things." She opened it. Old school papers, trophies, a pair of tiny shoes, a plastic toy. She smiled. Then she sat on a box. She said, "I remember these." I sat beside her. These were the kids. She held up the little shoes. "Our daughter wore these." "Yeah." "How long ago?" I thought. 30 years? She smiled. "Wow." We sat there. Suddenly the storage unit didn't feel ridiculous. It felt like a museum.
A very badly organized museum. She looked around. "We should keep some of this," I said. "Exactly. But not all of it." I sighed. "I know." Then she looked at the old television. "That can go." I said, "No." "Frank, it works." She looked at the television. "You haven't plugged it in." "I know." "How do you know it works?" I paused. "Faith." She laughed. I said, "That's important." We started going through boxes, keep, donate, trash. But now it felt different. We weren't destroying memories, we were choosing them. That made the process easier. Until we got to one box. It was labeled, "Frank, do not open." My wife looked at me. "What is this?" I said, "I don't remember." She said, "You wrote it." Apparently I did. She opened it. Inside was an old leather jacket, a baseball glove, a stack of letters, a cassette tape, and a photograph. I picked up the photograph. It was me, 23 years old, standing beside my first car. I barely recognized myself. My wife looked at it. She smiled. "You were handsome." I said, "I still am." She laughed. She said, "Were you always this confident?" "Yes." "And annoying?" "Yes." "Good." She put her hand on mine. I looked at the photograph again. For a moment, I felt 23. Then I looked at the storage unit, and I realized something. You don't really get rid of the past. You just decide where to keep it. I should have known my children would find out. They always do. My daughter came over one Sunday. She saw empty spaces in the garage. She said, "Dad?" "Yes." "What happened?" "What?" "The garage." "What about it?" "It's cleaner." I said, "Thank you." She looked at me suspiciously. "Where did everything go?" "Somewhere." "Where?" "Storage." She stared at me. "How big?" "Small." "How small?" 8 by 10. She laughed. "Dad." "What?" "You rented a storage unit." "Yes." "What did you put in it?" "Stuff." "What kind of stuff?" "Useful stuff." She smiled. "You moved your clutter to another building." I said, "That's an unfair description." "It's accurate." My son came in. "What are you guys talking about?" My daughter said, "Dad rented storage." My son laughed. "Of course he did." I said, "What's funny?" "You're 70. So? You're supposed to be downsizing." "I am." "You've expanded into real estate." My daughter laughed. I said, "You two have no respect for history." My son looked at me. "You know what?" "What?" "I'm actually glad you're keeping some of that." I smiled. He continued, "But Dad." "Yeah?" "You have 3 boxes of my old college papers." I said, "Exactly." "I don't want them." "They're yours." "I don't need them." "They're yours." "Throw them out." I looked at my wife. She looked at me. My son said, "Seriously, you don't have to keep them." I opened a box. There were old notebooks, receipts, a college sweatshirt, a broken calculator, a photograph, a letter my son had written when he was 20. I read it. I smiled. He said, "Dad?" "Yeah?" "You can throw it away." I looked at him. "You wrote this." "I know." "You were 20." "I know." "You'll want it someday." He laughed. "Maybe." I put it back. "Fine." My daughter found a box of her own. She opened it. Inside was an old stuffed animal. She laughed. "Oh my God." I said, "You used to sleep with that." "I know." She picked it up. She hugged it. Then she looked at me. "Dad?" "Yeah?" "Don't throw this one away." I smiled. I wasn't planning to. She nodded. We kept going. The kids started choosing things. Some they wanted, some they didn't. But something changed. They stopped laughing at my habit of keeping things. Because they started remembering. And then my daughter said, "You know, Dad?" "What?" "Maybe the problem isn't the stuff." I said, "What is it?" "We just don't know which things matter
until we see them again. I looked at her. That was smart. I said, "You should charge for advice." She laughed. "From you?" I said, "Exactly." Then my son found a box. It was full of old cables.
He opened it. He said, "Dad?" "What?" "What are these?" I said, "Cables." "For what?" I looked. "I don't know." He laughed. "Do you need them?" I said, "Yes." "Why?" "Because they're cables." He shook his head. I said, "Don't laugh." He said, "Dad, these are from 3 different decades." "That means they're experienced." He laughed. I put the box aside. My wife walked over. She looked at it. She said, "Frank?" I said, "Yes?" "You have a cable labeled maybe important?" I looked. It said, "Maybe important." I smiled. "See?" "What?" "I planned ahead." She laughed. My children left that afternoon. The garage was half empty. The storage unit was still full. But for the first time, I wasn't ashamed of it. I had spent my whole life collecting things. Not because I was greedy, because life keeps giving you moments. You keep a shirt, a photograph, a letter, a ticket, a key, a box, a stupid old radio, and eventually, you have a garage full of memories. Maybe that's not a problem. Maybe that's a life. There was one final box. My wife found it in the attic. It was huge. She brought it downstairs. She said, "What is this?" I looked at it. I recognized it. "No." She laughed. "What?" "No." "You know what's in it." "Yes." "Then tell me." I said, "I'm not ready." She laughed. "Frank, what's in the box?" I said, "My past." She stared at me. "You've been watching too many movies." I said, "Maybe." We opened it. Inside were things from our entire marriage. Our first apartment key, our wedding invitation, old movie tickets, a menu from our first anniversary, the first checkbook, our children's hospital bracelets, school drawings, a broken watch, letters, photographs, a napkin with something written on it. My wife picked it up. "What is this?" I said, "I don't remember." She looked closer. It said, "Don't forget the milk." We laughed. I said, "That might be the most accurate summary of our marriage." She laughed so hard, she had to sit down.
Then she found an old birthday card. She opened it. She read it. She smiled. She looked at me. "This is from you." "Really?" "Yes." She handed it to me. I read it. It was terrible. Terrible. I had written, "Happy birthday. I love you." That's it. I looked at her. I said, "Romantic." She laughed. "You wrote more than that." I turned it over. There was another sentence. "I also took the trash out." She laughed. I said, "See? That was 38 years ago. I've been consistent." We went through more boxes. Then we found photographs. Our first apartment, our first Christmas, the kids when they were little, our vacations, our parents, our friends, people who aren't here anymore, people whose names we hadn't said in years. My wife got quiet. She held one photograph. It was of her father. She said, "I miss him." I sat beside her. "I know." She said, "He would have hated all this technology." I laughed. "Absolutely." She smiled. "He couldn't figure out the microwave." I remember. "He used to hit it when it didn't work." I said, "That was his troubleshooting method." She laughed. He would have liked you. I said, Why? You hit things too. I said, I don't hit things. She looked at me. I said, Not anymore. We kept sorting. By the end, we had 3 piles: keep, give to the kids, recycle. I looked at the recycle pile. I felt strange. It was mostly paper, old manuals, old bills, old magazines, things we had kept because they were part of life. My wife said, Are you okay? I nodded. Yeah. She said, It's hard. I said, Yeah. She sat beside me. Then she said, You know what the funny thing is? What? We spent 40 years putting things in boxes. And now? Now we're spending our time opening them. I smiled. That's not so bad. No. Then she kissed me. I looked at the giant cardboard box. I said, We're keeping it. She laughed. What? The box. Why? In case we need it. She looked at me. I smiled. She laughed. Frank. What?
Some things never change. That's why you married me. She shook her head. That's not why. Why then? She smiled. Because you make me laugh. I smiled. Then she added, Mostly by accident. I said, I'll take it. By the end of the month, the garage looked different. Cleaner, more open. We had donated things, sold things, given things to the kids, thrown away some things, and kept the important stuff. The old toolbox, the photographs, the letters, the wedding invitation, my father's tools, the stupid toaster. Yes, the toaster survived. My wife said, You're really keeping that? I said, Yes. Where? In the kitchen. It doesn't work. I know. Then what is it doing in the kitchen? Serving as a reminder. Of what? Progress. She laughed. I put it on a shelf. Next to it was the old coffee maker. She said, You're impossible. I said, It's a museum. Of broken appliances? Of our life. She smiled. Fine. Then she did something unexpected.
She put an old photograph beside them. It was a picture of us in our first apartment. We looked young, poor, tired, happy. I looked at it. She said, That's better. I nodded. It was. The garage wasn't empty. It was meaningful. Every box had a reason. Every shelf had a purpose. We had made room without erasing ourselves. My son came over. He looked around. Wow. What? It looks great. Thank you. He walked to the shelf. What is that? I said, The toaster. He laughed. You kept it? Of course. He picked it up. Does it work? I said, No. He laughed. Then why? I looked at my wife. She smiled. I said, Because I can. My grandson came in. He saw the old photographs. He said, Grandpa, who's that? I pointed. Me. He looked at the photograph. That's you? Yes. You were skinny. I said, Thank you. He laughed. That's not an insult. I know. He pointed to my first car. Did you really drive that? Yes. No screen? No. No GPS? No. No Bluetooth? No.
How did you survive? I said, We had maps. Paper? Yes. He shook his head. How did you know where you were? I said, We looked. He laughed. Then he pointed to the photograph of my wife. Grandma looks young.
I said, she was. My wife heard me. Frank. I said, what? Be careful. I smiled. My grandson laughed. He said, you're still in trouble. I said, after 42 years, I've earned it. My grandson took out his phone. Can I make a video? My wife said, no. He said, why? Because we're not turning the garage into the internet again. I laughed. He laughed. Then my phone buzzed. I looked at it. It was a message from the storage facility. Payment due. I groaned. My wife looked at me. What? The storage unit. She stared. Frank. I said, what? She smiled. We haven't talked about that. I said, I know. How much are we paying? I hesitated. It's not important. She crossed her arms. How much? I told her. Her eyes widened. That's how much? I nodded.
She looked at me, then at the garage, then at me again. You rented another house for our memories. I said, it's a small house. She laughed. We have to empty it. I looked at her. No. Yes. We just finished. That was the garage. The storage unit is part of the garage. No, it isn't. I said, it feels connected. She laughed. No. I said, please. She smiled. Frank. I sighed. Fine. We went to the storage unit the next morning. I opened the door. I immediately realized we had a problem. We had kept too much. My wife looked at me. Where do we start? I said, cables. She laughed. I opened the cable box. My grandson happened to be with us. He saw it. He said, what's all this? I said, technology. He picked up a cable. What is this? No idea. Another. No idea. Another. No idea. He looked at me. Grandpa. What? You really don't know? No. Then why did you keep them? I said, because your generation keeps inventing things that need cables. He laughed. My wife said, keep? I looked at the box. I took a breath. Donate. She smiled. One decision, then another. A box of old manuals. Recycle. Old magazines. Recycle. Broken electronics. Recycle. 3 lamps. Donate. A chair. Keep. Why? Because it was comfortable. Some things survive because they're useful. Others because they're beautiful. Others because they're memories. You just have to know which is which. We worked for hours. At the end, the storage unit was half empty. My wife smiled. She said, you know what? What? I think we're actually doing it. What? Downsizing. I looked around. She was right. And I felt good. Not empty. Good. We weren't throwing away our lives. We were making room for the next part. There was one object left, a small wooden chair. It was ugly, paint chipped. One leg had been repaired. The seat was scratched. My wife said, that has to go. I said, no. Frank, no. We have 4 chairs. This one is different. How? I looked at it. I remembered. The chair had belonged to my father. He used to sit in it in the garage. When I was a kid, I would sit on the floor beside him. He'd fix things. I'd watch. Sometimes he'd let me hold the flashlight. Sometimes I'd hand him the wrong screwdriver. He'd say, that's not the one. I'd give him another. That's not it either. Eventually, he'd laugh, and we'd figure it out. That chair was where I learned how to fix things, where I learned patience, where I learned that most problems don't require panic. You just look, you try, you fix what you can. My wife looked at me. She knew. She said, "Okay." We kept the chair. We put it in the garage, not because we needed another chair, because it was part of the story. That evening, I sat in it. My grandson came over. He sat on the floor beside me. He looked at the chair. "Grandpa?" "Yeah? Why do you keep old things?" I thought about it. I said, "Because someday, they're going to be the only way you can remember what it felt like." He didn't say anything. I said, "You don't have to keep everything." "Then what do you keep?" I looked around. "The things that still mean something." He nodded. Then he took out his phone. I said, "What are you doing?" "Taking a picture." "Of what?" "The chair." I laughed. "You're taking a picture of something you could actually keep." He said, "Yeah." I smiled. "Good." He showed me the picture. It looked beautiful. The old chair, the toolbox beside it, the garage behind us, the light coming through the window. I said, "That's actually pretty good." He smiled. "I know." I said, $20. He laughed. A week later, we finished. The house was cleaner, the garage was better, the attic had room, the storage unit was almost empty. We had fewer things, but somehow the house felt fuller. My wife and I sat in the living room. She looked around. She said, "Do you notice anything?" I smiled. "Yes." "What?" "It feels bigger." She nodded. "You were right." "About what?" "We didn't need to throw away everything." She smiled. "No." I looked at her. "Thank you." She said, "For what?" "For understanding." She took my hand. "We're getting older, Frank." "I know." "We have to make room." "I know." "But not just in the house." I looked at her. She said, "For whatever comes next." I nodded. That sentence stayed with me. Whatever comes next. I had spent a lot of time looking backward, at old things, old photographs, old memories, old versions of myself. But there was still a life ahead. Different, smaller maybe, slower, but still there. I smiled. Then my wife stood up. She said, "Frank?" "Yeah?" "I have one more thing." I froze. "No." She laughed. "It's not bad." "What is it?" She went into the kitchen. She came back carrying the old toaster. She put it in front of me. "This." I stared at it. She said, "You've been defending this thing for 3 weeks." "Yes." "It doesn't work." "I know." "It takes up space." "I know." "You don't use it." "I know." She smiled. "So..." I looked at the toaster. I looked at my wife. I looked at the garage. I thought about the photograph, my father, the chair, the toolbox, the first apartment, the kids, the broken coffee maker, the cable box, the years. Then I smiled. I said, "Okay." She looked surprised. "Okay?" "Yes." "We're throwing it away?" I nodded. She smiled. I picked up the toaster. I walked toward the trash. My wife followed. I opened the lid. Then I stopped. I looked at it. I said, "Wait." She laughed. "What now?" I said, "I just realized something." "What?" I don't need the toaster. She smiled. Good. I said, but what? I don't need to throw it away either. She stared at me. Frank. I smiled. Give it to our grandson. My grandson was standing in the doorway. He looked confused. Why me? I said, because one day you'll be 70. He laughed. I'll never be 70. I said, that's what I thought. He took the toaster. He looked at it. This thing doesn't even work. I said, exactly. He laughed. I said, keep it. Why? I pointed at the chair. At 70, you'll understand. He smiled. My wife shook her head. You're turning him into you. I said, that's what grandparents are for. She laughed. And that was how the great downsizing ended. We didn't get rid of everything. We didn't keep everything. We kept the things that told our story, and we let go of the things that were simply taking up space. That sounds simple. It isn't. At 70, you realize something. The older you get, the less you want to own, and the more you want to remember. You stop asking, how much does this cost? You start asking, what does this mean? You stop asking, will I use this? You ask, will I miss it? You stop trying to build a bigger life. You start trying to make the life you have feel complete. My wife and I finished the coffee. She looked around. Do you like it? I said, yes. What changed? I smiled. There's less stuff. She nodded. And? More room. For what? I looked at her. For us. She smiled. That's the part nobody tells you. Downsizing isn't really about getting rid of your life. It's about making room to live it. I thought about my father, his toolbox, his chair, his let's see. I realized that's what we had been doing all along. Let's see. Let's see what works. Let's see what matters. Let's see what stays. Let's see what's next. My wife looked at me. Frank? Yeah? Do you know what I found? What? She held up the old key from the cabinet. The mystery key. I laughed. Oh, that. You know what it opens? No? She smiled. I found out. What? She held it up. It opens the old shed. I stared at her. You're kidding. No. I stood up. That's incredible. Why? Because I've been keeping that key for 30 years. And now we know what it's for. I smiled. See? She laughed. See what? The key was important. She shook her head. You got lucky. I said, no. I picked up my coffee. I planned ahead. She laughed. Then she said, come on. Where? The shed. What are we doing? We're cleaning it. I stopped. I looked at her. She smiled. I said, of course we are. She laughed. I grabbed the old toolbox. We walked outside. I opened the shed. Inside were 2 chairs, 3 boxes, and a broken fan. My wife looked at me. I looked at her. She said, Frank. I said, don't worry. What? I smiled. I know exactly where this is going. She laughed. Where? I opened the first box. Into the storage unit. She stared at me. I smiled. She started laughing. I laughed too. Then I said, I'm kidding. I picked up the box. I carried it to the trash. My wife looked surprised. She said, Frank? I said, "What?" She smiled. "I'm proud of you." I said, "Don't get used to it." We laughed. And that's how we finished. Not with a perfect house, not with an empty garage, not with every memory neatly labeled. Just with enough space to breathe, enough things to remember, enough life left to make new memories. And a 70-year-old man finally learning that not everything has to be kept, just because it once mattered. Sometimes you keep the story, you let the object go. And sometimes you keep the object, because it's a damn good chair. My wife walked toward the house. She called, "Frank?" "Yeah." "Are you coming?" "In a minute." "What are you doing?" I looked at my father's toolbox, the old chair, the garage, the empty space. I smiled. "Just looking." She laughed. "You and your father." I smiled. Then I heard her say, "And don't forget the trash." I looked at the trash bags. I sighed. "Of course." I grabbed them. I started walking. Then I stopped. I looked back at the garage. I smiled, and I said, "You know what?" My wife turned. "What?" "I think we did pretty good." She smiled. "Yeah." I said, "Still got the house." She nodded. "Still got each other." I nodded. "Still got the kids?" "Yes." "Still got the grandkids?" "Yes." "Still got the chair?" She laughed. "Yes, Frank." I smiled. "Then I think we're doing okay." She said, "We are." I started toward the curb. Then my grandson yelled from the garage, "Grandpa!" "What?" "Where do you want me to put the toaster?" I stopped. I looked at my wife. She looked at me. I said, "There's only one thing to do." "What?" I smiled. "Keep it." She laughed. I shouted, "Put it in the garage." My wife yelled, "Frank!" I laughed. My grandson laughed. And I knew immediately I'd probably never truly learn. But that's okay. Because at 70, life isn't about finally having everything figured out. It's about knowing what matters enough to keep, what matters enough to let go, and what matters enough to laugh about. And after 42 years of marriage, I finally understood something. My wife wasn't trying to throw away my past. She was trying to make room for my future. I looked at her. She smiled. I said, "You know." "What?" "That was actually pretty smart." She smiled. "I know." I shook my head. "Don't get used to hearing that." She laughed. Then she came over. She took my hand. We walked toward the house. The garage door closed behind us. For the first time in 40 years, there was room for the car. I looked at it. I smiled. My wife said, "What?" I said, "We spent a month cleaning the garage." Pause. "And now we actually have to put the car in here." She laughed. I laughed. We opened the door. My car barely fit. I looked at the shelves, the chairs, the toolbox, the chair, the toaster, the last remaining boxes. I said, "You know what?" My wife sighed. "What now?" "I think we need a bigger garage." She stared at me. I smiled. She started laughing. Then she said, "Frank?" "Yeah?" "We are not downsizing the garage." I laughed. "I know." She said, "Good." I said, "I'm just saying." She pointed at me. "No?" I nodded. "Okay." She smiled. We closed the garage and walked inside. My name is Frank. I'm 70, and apparently Downsizing is just another word for deciding what stories you still want to carry. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Don't throw away your memories. Just stop tripping over them. Good night.